All right, so what would you say your current role at Riot is?
So currently, I am a researcher and strategist for the R&D department, which is research and development. So it's a little confusing because I just said I do research for research and development. If you're following along there, the layman's terms of it though is I do research and strategy for our new games. Basically, thinking about how Riot's going to make new games, what sorts of new games we'll make, um, and it's a mixture of like market research, user experience research, or like UX research, um, high level product strategy and design strategy, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
Awesome. So give us a day to day for your role. When you clock in the morning, what do you do?
I probably can't talk about that. I think
Okay.
that I think the day to day for like what we like the actual day to day, I can't really discuss honestly, because there's some secret sauce there.
Ooh.
The sort of higher level of what I do, the higher level of what I do, I can kind of go through and like what we've talked about and like the parts of creating a game, right? So, the way Riot thinks about creating a game is through a few phases. There's the incubation phase, there's the prototype phase, there's pre-production, there's production, and then there's the sort of live state of a game. I typically work in the incubation and prototype stage, so sometimes my job is working to come up with ideas for games, to come up with, yeah, basically pitch games to Riot is something I get to do. Um, Other times it's working before we even write code, before we even think about creating a game. We think about like what are the things that are going to go into making a specific game, who's the audience going to be for, um, what motivations is that game going to address, etc. Sorry, I'm basically reading off of an article that the leads of the R&D department posted so that I don't stray too far out of what is okay to talk about. And then a lot of times, like what our sort of team does is we build prototypes. We build sort of what we would call like the scaffolding of a game. That sort of basic level of a game with which we can then build innovations on. I think a good way to talk about this would be like games that already exist, like Valorant. The scaffolding of a game like Valorant is like, okay, you want to make a tack shooter. You need to have the fundamentals of tack shooting. So presumably you'll actually just have one map, like one really good map. In the same way that kind of the crux of CS:GO can kind of be understood via what's the popular? I'm not versed in CS:GO. Is it Dust? What's the one everyone plays?
Yeah, that's DE.
Yeah, yeah, right. So it's like you could have like Dust, right? And then you have the your core movement down, your core shooting down, and once you have that sort of scaffolding in sort of very gray boxy prototype stuff, then you might be like, okay, now we're gonna put Sage. You know, she'll have no art. She's literally just a stick figure, but we're gonna give her some abilities, and her abilities at this time wouldn't be like they wouldn't be her ice walls, people call it. By the way, it's actually supposed to be like a gem or like geomancer wall, but whatever. Everyone skips over that. In this case, it'd be like, hey, you know what? We don't know what this character is, but we're gonna have a character that has an ability that creates a wall, and we're gonna have a character that creates a slow field and maybe has a revive. Or the general idea being that like we're gonna take the this idea of like utility and character abilities that exist in maybe games like Apex and Overwatch and even in games like League of Legends, and we're gonna inject characters um, and those character abilities as the form of utility into this tack shooter. And that would be the sort of like innovation that you put on top to test, right? Our job is to, again, test out, build out those scaffolds, that sort of basic foundation of a game, and then test the innovations on top of them.
That's a very definitive answer. That's probably one of the best answers we've gotten for that question so far. So,
Yeah, again, that's like I mean, it was day to day, but that's kind of high level what we're doing without giving away like how we, because again, that we do that, people are like, wow, yeah, of course you do that. We've seen that with how you made Valorant, but it's like the sort of devil's in the details with how we go about that, and that's sort of what I get to work on.
all right. So since we can't talk too much about what your current day to day is, why don't we talk a little bit about your previous role at Riot, which was as a gameplay insight specialist for League. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so much in it's very different sort of from the job I did now, but I can sort of speak again if we think about the parts of game development at Riot where you have, okay, Riot does this sort of this incubation phase where we're like literally just pitching ideas and developing a framework for a game. And that prototype is building the scaffolding and some of the core innovations. And in pre-production, we are, getting the game ready to like be built, and like production being literally building the game. Riot has a really cool instance where I think a lot of those phases exist for many games or for like many studios. But one of the cool things about Riot is like a lot of times it's like, oh, and then once you ship, you're kind of done. Both for Riot and honestly for a lot more game companies, even ones we wouldn't have historically thought about. I mean, we see this with Rockstar's dedication to Grand Theft Auto. We see this with, I mean, obviously Epic and Fortnite, Blizzard and Overwatch. More and more we see this sort of games as a service. So that live service component, that's what I did for League of Legends, specifically on kind of gameplay products. And what's interesting is that same framework of incubation, prototype, pre-production, production live is actually how you can think about the kind of work I did on League of Legends, but it was specific to the individual projects and products on League of Legends. So much in the same way that, we create an idea of a game and then the scaffold of a game and then the innovations of a game and then go through building that game, adding art, adding sound, adding all these things. You could apply that exact same theory to how we build a champion. And that was something that I supported from the insights perspective. And a lot of that looks like um, doing these sort of high level advisory stuff on what kinds of champions to make, which oftentimes comes from data that we have, such as play rate data of what champions players are currently playing. Sometimes, I mean, but oftentimes it just comes from like, hey, our taste makers, our designers, our artists have a really cool idea. They want to create it. Part of my job is then building out ways to test whether we're achieving what we want to do with that champion. And that actually is like not the big data sets that I work in when we talk about play rate data, win rate data, et cetera. That's something like bringing, and we've talked about this externally with players many times. So like we actually bring in a bunch of players to our facilities in LA to play test new champions early on when they're in sort of that prototype phase. And what's cool is like a prototype phase for a champion, like an example of that for Kaisa would be Kaisa was just purple Lucian. We literally just took Lucian's model, we colored it purple, and the abilities for Kaisa were just borrowed abilities from other characters. Again, we were proving out that concept of the champion that we wanted to make before we go into things like pre-production and production, where we add in art, we add in the full narrative, we add in her VO, etc. So I would help guide and this is sort of the time when we talk about gameplay insights, again, to sort of step back and talk about the broader role. This is the part where research is involved. This is UX research, this is market research, and I'm not only advising sort of on who we're making this champion for and like where our potential target audiences are. I'm also helping to make the champion by providing the designers and the artists with real player data, like players coming in, playing their champions over the course of say like a weekend, giving us feedback on the gameplay, giving us feedback on the concept art, and I'm helping to interpret that feedback to help make recommendations to make the champions better. Finally, we get to that last step, which is once the champion is released, I look at all sorts of now like big data to assess how the champion's doing, right? So our team is, while we don't make the balance changes, we are responsible for the like the balance data. So the gameplay insights team is responsible for balance data. They're also responsible for things like play rate data, how much is the character being played, the breadth versus depth framework that we've talked about, which is essentially breadth, how many people are playing the champion, depth, how much are they playing it. And we're looking at that by demographics, by regions, by all sorts of stuff to sort of assess how well that champion's doing. Uh, and then we're also looking now at sort of mass sentiment on the champion. If we recall, those labs were maybe anywhere from in the course of development, a champion might be seen by anywhere from 40 to 100 external players who will get the chance to like play test it during development. But within the first minute of it being launched, right, already, tens of thousands of players will now play the champion. Okay, so now we can up sort of the scale of our sample for that sentiment. And we run things like champion post-launch surveys. More sort of recently, we kind of swapped to almost exclusively doing what we do almost at about a yearly cadence, which is our mass champion survey, which assesses all of the champions in League of Legends on their gameplay, if they're fun to play, if they're frustrating to play against, their visual appeal, their thematic cohesion, whether you want to see them in comics or purchase physical merch of that champion. It assesses all of this stuff on a sentiment level from players all over the world. And we're talking like hundreds of thousands of players for the sample of this. And the amount of data and like if you really wanted to, you could hire someone full time to just make and maybe we should. You'd probably hire someone full time to just make deck after deck and report after report from just this survey alone, looking at champions based on player age, how long they've been playing League of Legends, gender demographics, regional demographics, player motivations for why they play certain games. All of this stuff is captured in that survey. And when you couple that survey then with the play rate data or the breadth versus depth data, you have a whole sort of ability to look at champions in League of Legends, both their absolute win rates, their play rates, what players think and feel about them, and you get really, really rich data and understanding about your champions across all the different regions. Sometimes it's a little too rich because you almost get information or whatever is information paralysis or decision paralysis because there's almost too much, and that's like part of my job then is like actually sussing out what sorts of decisions we make given all this information, because sometimes data from one region can be at odds with data from another region for what you would do with it. That's an example of what we do on gameplay insights, and that's just champions. We haven't even touched on, we do that same sort of process when we're making big seasonal changes, when we're making systems level changes, like adding in like the 5 band systems. The way I like to generally think about it is like gameplay insights is responsible for like understanding the state of League of Legends from a like game telemetry perspective and a player sentiment perspective, putting all that together and then advising basically our lead designers and the people who set League of Legends vision for what we should be doing with the game. And sometimes that's granular on like a champion by champion basis. Sometimes that's higher level for the game itself.